Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles to Angelo Robles' Effective Family Office podcast, where I look to distill the best practices and best ideas of the world's most successful families and their family offices. I hope to provide thought-provoking opinions and feature amazing thought leaders to our listeners of the podcast with an eye towards the future of the family office. Today's podcast, and we're so fortunate to have such amazing guests that's really esteemed as they are, and I'm very honored. The podcast is Join Me and the WHO, UN Foundation, and other industry leaders. We are finding solutions to predict and impact the new normal. We're doing a rather complex video and podcast, at least by our standards today. We have 5 guests on. And because we have so many guests, how we're going to do it, and I'm going to introduce very briefly the guest and the sequence of the guest in a second, is we're going to spend 12 to 15 minutes with each guest. We do know that we normally like longer form interviews, so this will be a little bit more soundbite-like, but actually it might even be more efficient and succinct. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. The sequence of our special guest, and we're again very honored by who they are, is first Dr. David Nabarro, Special Envoy to the WHO Director General on COVID-19, co-chair of the Forum on Climate Change, and the Health for the World Innovation Summit for Health. We also are joined next after that by Mei Yu of COVAX and United Neuroscience. She launched one of the first endobody vaccines. That will be a very intriguing discussion. We're then very honored to be joined by Elizabeth Cousins, President and CEO of the UN Foundation, and then by Jeff Gitterman Wealth Management, and host of Bloomberg TV's The Impact. And Jeff always does a great job. We're honored to have him. And the one person I do have a past relationship with, he's such a great guy. And last, but certainly not least, that would be Ed Martin, Chief OmniWin Officer. We'll get to that. Fifth Element, and really doing amazing work. So he's going to be very, very unique, and will be a wonderful way to kind of wrap things up during ballpark about an hour and a half that we're going to commit to today. On that note, welcome everyone to the show, and Dr. Nabarro, without further ado, starting with you. Thank you for your time today. We greatly appreciate it. It's great to have you on, and why don't we jump right into it? If you could explain the World Health Organization's role during the current COVID-19 pandemic.
Of course, thank you very much indeed. So everybody, I'm so pleased to be with you. The World Health Organization is a technical organization made up of public health experts, epidemiologists, and scientists, and our job is to study all aspects of health and provide guidance to everybody on the basis of what we see happening. We work under a governing body of 194 countries. They're called member states. They set the rules under which we operate. They set our budget. They review our work. We're run by a director general who's called Dr. Tedros. We have 7,000 staff in 101 country offices, 6 regional offices, and Geneva. Our annual budget is around $2 billion a year, which is 1/3 of the budget of the United States Centers for Disease Control. We have to deal with every aspect of health. We work very closely with all the nations who sponsor us, but we're not set up as a health inspectorate. Instead, we operate within the restrictions that are given us by the nations. On dealing with infectious disease outbreaks, we work under something called the International Health Regulations, which is a treaty that was negotiated in 2005 and which has been updated subsequently. This treaty says if there's a report of a disease coming in from anywhere, we must investigate it and find out whether or not that disease is serious. Every year we get thousands of reports of new diseases, which are examined through the recently reformed Health Emergencies Program, which is under the leadership of Dr. Michael Ryan, an executive director. We first found out about this new disease causing atypical pneumonia through a notification received on December the 31st, 2019. We set up an incident management unit early in January, and subsequently we sought information from the country where the disease was found, that was China, about what they knew, what was going on, and they supplied us with information. Around the 15th or 16th of January, we became particularly concerned that there was human-to-human transmission. We did not know whether it was sustained or sporadic. This is one of the issues you always have to decide when these things are starting. By the 22nd of January, we called world experts together in the Health Emergency Committee, asked them for advice. They said at that time, this is not a public health emergency of international concern, but then they were reconvened on January the 30th. They declared it was a public health emergency. And then immediately from that day onwards, we said to every country in the world, look out, this is a bad virus. There are certain things you need to do, but most importantly, if the virus appears anywhere in your country, you've got to stop transmission through rapid and robust action immediately. It's not a flu, it's a coronavirus, it's dangerous. Since then, just to finish, we have been working as effectively as we can with all our staff, with all the countries that we're networked with, continuously, day in, day out, doing the following. Number one, continuing to understand as much as we can about this virus and how it can be stopped from spreading. And we believe we know the best ways to do so. Number two, we've been trying to find out everything we can about the way in which the virus causes disease. Number three, we've been dealing with a world shortage of essential protective equipment and medicines, particularly for poor countries. And together with other parts of the United Nations, we've set up an airline, a procurement service, a distribution service for protective equipment and for tests. And then lastly, we are now actually doing a very large amount of work with particularly the poorer countries of the world, which are now being affected by this virus in a very serious way, in order to try to help them, because they are much weaker in terms of health systems than, for example, the Western Europe or the United States. There's much more to say, but Angelo, we are working for the people of the world. We work for everybody. We have no discrimination with regard to nationality, sex, wealth, or ethnicity. We work for everybody because we believe that all human life is equal. And so, just in case there's any question on anybody's minds, we do not have favorite countries or have favorite communities. But what we do is we rely on countries to tell us what's going on, because we do not have the power of inspection or enforcement. That has not been given to us by our governors, the 194 member states, which include, of course, the United States of America, a long-term partner of the World Health Organization, a major financier, and a source of many of the great professionals that are among our 7,000 staff. And we want to continue our partnership with the United States as long as that is within the interests of the United States government.
Of course, that was a wonderful overview. And again, I wish we had a lot more time, and I still have time for a couple of questions. And we absolutely appreciate the organization's role and your role in terms of your commitment to eradicating, I guess you could say, the horrific coronavirus that we're going through and your deep experiences in it. You did say one thing, and you probably knew this question would come, but the date of the last day of the year, 12/31 of 19, China informing the World Health Organization, if I remember my logistics of it correctly, it was first introduced or thought of in what happened in November. What I'm basically getting at is it appears like they might have been a little bit slow to getting the information to the World Health Organization. What could we do in the future to make sure that there's greater communication much, much quicker?
Thank you very much indeed. Whenever an outbreak is suspected, there's always a delay before the information is passed to the World Health Organization. There are various reasons for it. Countries don't want to send false alarms. Secondly, they want to be absolutely certain of what's going on. And thirdly, they want to be sure that when the information is provided, there will not suddenly be a huge backlash. We saw this when the Ebola virus appeared in West Africa towards the end of 2013, and then we were working on it early in 2014. There is a lag period. When the evaluation is done, and after every outbreak, we expect something called an after-action review. There will be a very forensic examination of what happened in those early days. That's as it will be, and it's as it should be, and every single one of us is accountable and expect that. I personally cannot make any comment from where I'm sitting now about what happened before the WHO was notified from China about this disease at the end of December. When the investigations are done, no doubt other things may be revealed, but that's as it is. For now, our focus is on moving forward. I want to stress, this is a really dangerous virus. It must not be underestimated. It has the potential to cause a large number of people to die and to overload and overwhelm health services. That's been clear, for example, in New York recently. But right now, this virus is spreading into poor countries. They're very much less well equipped to deal with it. And we want to put all our efforts and all the efforts that we can call on from all over the world to support poor countries as they try to deal with the effect of this really unpleasant virus. Last point, the virus does not look as though it's going to go away anytime soon. Coronaviruses are notoriously stable. We've never had a coronavirus quite like this, which has significant death potential and at the same time spreads very, very easily and quickly. We need to be able to help every country to defend themselves against this virus and to defend themselves against continuous spikes of disease that will come because of the way in which it transmits. The only hope we have to get on top of this virus is either a treatment that is low cost, that cures everybody, and personally I don't think that will come, or a vaccine that is highly effective, that's available in sufficient amounts to be given to every single person in the world so that we have everybody safely and effectively protected against the virus. A vaccine that's just available for a few people will not be helpful, as the people who most need the vaccine are the poorest people in our world, who are least able to protect themselves and have the least facilities to deal with any illness. So my hope is that we will have an effective vaccine or vaccines proven to be safe and proven to be good, but available at sufficient number that everybody in the world can get them at the same time. And that can be done through a global effort for total immunization of the world. That's something the World Health Organization is particularly focused on. And our anxiety, of course, is that there will be a small amount of vaccine available to a small number of people in wealthy countries. And that would be a really bad situation.
Yes, indeed. And we'll get a little bit more to the vaccine info with the next guest, May. Probably only have enough time for one or two more quick questions, Doctor. What's the next frontier in the pandemic, and kind of what keeps you up and a little concerned at night?
I am very concerned every night. I wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning because of two facts really. One is that this does not sweep through countries like influenza, making a large number of people quickly immune. It has very focal, quite tightly located outbreaks that build up quite quickly. And if you don't watch them and deal with them very rapidly, the virus spreads widely. A number of countries spent several weeks debating how they were going to deal with this virus. And while they were debating, it spread widely and it got deeply embedded into these countries. They've had movement restrictions which have reduced the spread, but now people are starting to move around. As the movement restrictions have stopped, we're going to see more little outbreaks spike up in Western Europe, in North America, and in other parts of the world. Second big worry is that it's got into poor countries, and it's got into very dense population, dense areas of settlement in poor countries, in slums in India, in favelas in Latin America, in townships in Africa. My big worry is that we'll get stuck in these densely populated locations, continue to cause disease, and continue to cause suffering for quite a long time, i.e. until we have the vaccine. It's the impact of this virus in poor countries and the continued presence of this virus in some advanced countries, meaning that we will go on having outbreaks, as I say, that will cause problems. And I don't want them to lead to economic shutdown for any longer, because that has such terrible impacts, not only on people's health and well-being, but also on their economies. So we must get basic defenses into communities all over the world through what we call public health services, testing, tracing, and isolating. That's the only way to stop outbreaks from building up. And we need that for the economies to restart, for travel to restart, for trade to restart, and for employment, particularly in hard-hit sectors like tourism, to restart. And so getting public health right and then making sure that the economies can restart well is my priority. And I wish that countries could stop presenting the current policy situation as a choice between public health and the economy. It's not either or, it's both and. And that's what keeps me up at night, that I can't get that message across.
What has New Zealand done correctly?
New Zealand realized immediately of the need for robust action to defend all communities against this virus, being on the alert, identifying people with the disease, isolating them quickly, tracing their contacts, isolating them. The Prime Minister had regular discussion with the people, explaining what happened. There was no dissent, no people saying, you've got it wrong, no unpleasantness around it. It was just quite simple. We can be safe if we do this. And the people got her message. The health services were organized and they put the defenses in place extremely quickly. And they've held those defenses. They're lucky in being an island, but they know they're going to get new cases coming back. So they're continuing the defenses and the alertness. Singapore's done very well too, in that they got on top of it quickly. But they also knew they might get cases coming back. And they also knew that their migrant worker dormitories were a particularly high-risk area. They've got the COVID back. It's in one of the migrant worker dormitories. They're working extremely hard to isolate the people there and to make sure it doesn't spread beyond the dormitory. And I believe Singapore will get on top of it. So South Korea got on top of it. And in Europe, Germany, Austria, Denmark, Czech Republic, they're all getting on top of it. Greece is doing very well. You don't have to end up with the COVID all over the place. All you've got to do is act rapidly and robustly with the people fully informed and not have inconsistency in the policy positions of different parts of government. The virus exploits inconsistency and gets in between us and causes terrible problems.
And Dr. Nabarro, how could philanthropists, individuals, family offices, and others be useful to the WHO?
I would like to say that this is a global crisis like none I've ever seen before. We're at the earliest stage of it. As the virus moves more into poor countries, it's going to cause intense suffering. Poor countries can't afford to stop their economies to try to also limit the spread in the way that, for example, Western European countries can. Poor countries have got very limited health services, they're short of supplies, and they also need resources to make sure they've got the basic staff present to do the capacity for interrupting transmission. If I was a philanthropist with quite a lot of money to spare, I would put this money into some kind of fund that the WHO could access and then make available to poor countries to enable them to be able to deal with the virus as effectively as possible. I would make that money available with minimal conditions except for due diligence. Actually, that fund exists. It's been established by the UN Foundation. You may hear about it from Elizabeth Cousins. Mm-hmm. It's an obvious place to put resources. The impact and the benefit for the world will be absolutely enormous. We need the cash.
Dr. Nabarro, I greatly appreciate your time. Again, we do have 5 guests, so we're going to have to move on. It was incredibly helpful. You set a great foundation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
May, are you with us?
Hi, Angela, I'm here.
Hello, May. You're next. So May, why don't you explain, we'll start a little bit broad, what you're doing in your creation at COVAX and how it's potentially emerging as one of the key players in this pandemic.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me on the platform. Dr. Nabarro, it's very insightful what you've been saying. And in fact, our company is working on 2 of those elements, those tools, to help get us out of this crisis, which is, the first is an antibody test to help mass test and trace, identify folks that have already been exposed. And the second is indeed a vaccine. I think, we're one of many players. I don't think the world has ever seen an effort quite like this in terms of this many players all working in the same direction. But what our company has done is we've leveraged essentially 30 years of experience in both the antibody testing and vaccine, including launching and commercializing off of the platform to develop a COVID-19 test. We were fortunate to be a majority of our team is actually in Taiwan and China, so we're on the front lines. We not only responded to SARS back in the early 2000s, but when COVID-19 came around, we kind of leveraged that experience, and that kind of accelerated some of the movement going forward. I don't think the world has ever seen a virus the genetic sequence actually be released so quickly as well. I think it was, just in January, a few weeks after it was discovered, and so we quickly worked on that. But essentially, we're developing several candidates for vaccines, looking promising in animals, and really thinking of different ways to accelerate it. Because Dr. Nabarro is right, everything else is kind of a tool to bridge us, even the testing. We're getting testing up, and we're trying to increase infrastructure. I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is really connecting the dots, because the world has never seen a testing demand like this. But everything is to bridge to either a treatment or a vaccine that can be widely deployable. And the timelines for that deployment will vary, and the considerations of that deployment will vary. I think one of the most important things is, when you're talking about vaccine, you want safe, efficacious, and scalable. And the scalability is one of those that, 6 billion people in the world are vaccinated today. They were not all vaccinated at the same time. So the idea of vaccinating everyone, we have infrastructure in place, thankfully, to deliver vaccines, even in developing countries, but just that manufacturing challenge, we're facing things that are unprecedented, which is, why we're here, and it's our opportunity to show our innovation.
What do you think is the likelihood of having an effective vaccine, and when?
Those are the questions. I think anyone who can tell you definitively doesn't really know. But, so it's hard to say. And I don't want to hedge and not give you an answer, but there are lots of viruses that we thought that we could conquer very quickly that we still don't have vaccines against.
Right, decades or hundreds of years.
Exactly. I think there's enough work, and at least this coronavirus doesn't seem, highly mutating. It kind of stays how it is. There are already efforts underway that actually it's quite optimistic. In order to have something work, it also depends on degrees, right? They will be safe, very likely. That's the first hurdle. Whether they're effective, it could be a matter of effective in whom and how effective. If you just look at the flu vaccine right now, it's only effective in 50 or 60% of people who take it. And in the elderly particularly, it's half that. So one of the concerns is, how do we ensure a proper immune response within the elderly to a vaccine? Because they're one of the most vulnerable populations.
Yes.
And that is something that traditional vaccine technology has generally struggled with, because our immune system, deteriorates, declines with age. So I think that is one big challenge. There are vaccine platforms that address this. Our vaccine platform has previously been used, strangely, in diseases of the aging, so Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So that just, is one of those things that you think about as you triage in terms of efficaciousness. Another thing that I would just comment on is there are a lot of newsprints right now about neutralizing antibodies. How effective is this for for being able to confer protection? I think it's a big part of the story, but it's only one half of the story. Our body, immune system has multiple arms. It has cellular and humoral immunity, and you really need both to protect yourself from an infection. So there are vaccines that are in trials right now. They show very good neutralizing titers that can neutralize the virus, but somehow they don't protect the animals. And so what you're going to be looking for is really a more holistic vaccine. I do believe that things will come out. They will be available. Again, it's how efficacious is a question. It doesn't mean that we won't get there, but I think to think that the first, bat, we're going to hit it out of the park, is optimistic. But I'm optimistic overall for the industry.
I mean, even using something as HIV and AIDS as an example, there's effectively a cocktail of drugs that doesn't cure it per se, but obviously it's a significant beneficial impact on people. I believe I read in the BBC that there was thought from some thought leaders that before a vaccine, there may be, so to speak, a cocktail of various drugs that if taken more earlier on than we're doing now, that there's hope within a couple of months that may be, I'm going to be careful to use the word an effective treatment, but what are you hearing before we get to the vaccine? And I know that's going to be the ultimate. Might there be some level of other combinations of drugs that would be better than the treatments that we currently have?
I'd be careful to comment because that's not necessarily a field, but I know there are definitely combination trials going on. Actemra, remdesivir, I think just launched a trial. And, the good news is that there's lots of willing patients and there's lots of very smart scientists out there that are thinking of proper combinations. And because we've seen it work in the past, we're leveraging off that to see, how it will work in the future. So there are treatments that slow down the course of disease, decrease the severity, but ultimately, I think, we're still looking at bridging to a vaccine. And again, the biggest challenge of the vaccine is, one, you're going to get some level of efficacy, but how do we scale this, right? Traditional technologies, so China's using very traditional technologies. Theirs are inactivated viruses. These have their own challenges, that they're actually growing the virus. But they can be scaled likely to more developing countries because they use the same type of technology to manufacture their vaccines right now. One approach that we're taking is essentially chemical, it's synthetic. So it can be very scalable. I mean, we currently manufacture over 500 million doses for animal health indications, and these are priced at less than $1 a dose. So you can see the scale and the manufacturability of this approach, but these are still things to be worked out.
Why is testing and getting accurate information appears to be so problematic?
So there's two elements of that. One is the accuracy of the tests themselves. There are over 200 tests, antibody tests, for instance, in front of the US FDA right now. We had an advantage because we actually developed a SARS antibody test with the NIH back in 2003. And just the way that our technology works really influences specificity. So if you're taking the PCR test, which detects whether you have a viral infection, what you want to do is protect against a false negative. You don't want someone walking around with the virus thinking that they don't have it. With the antibody test, it's actually the opposite, where you want to protect against a false positive. The last thing you want is, out of the 10 people that you tell have antibodies, 7 of them actually don't, and they think that they're protected somehow and walking around. And so the accuracy of the test is very important. You really want to check the performance, particularly specificity for antibody testing. And that has taken time because these, they're limited samples. It's only been around for a few months. And so we've been working with a number of reference labs to make sure that we validate across all samples and also that we don't cross-react with other naturally occurring coronaviruses. So we've been fortunate in that sense. But another challenge we found is that there just simply isn't the infrastructure around to deploy these tests. And it's really about building the connections. So communities and corporations, they want to be deploying this to their employees, but they don't have in-house clinicians. So who's going to take the blood draws? Where are they going to process these tests? You're forcing them to essentially build the road. We have the cars, okay? We have the tests, they're there, but now where's the road for it to drive on? And that's the stuff that we're building, essentially. And one of the things that we've seen that we had to do is really work with a number of partners to help essentially connect the infrastructure so that people who want to get tested can actually go and get tested. So that's been one of the challenges and something I hope that we continue to invest in light of the future outbreaks that I hate to say inevitable, but most likely.
And the last question, May, the economics of bringing a vaccine and test to the market appear to be incredibly substantial. If you could talk a little bit about that, you would certainly be right on the forefront.
Well, the economics are always challenging when you have a pandemic and people dying. And the last thing you want to do is think about how you make a business out of it. It just needs to be sustainable. I think the CMS, at least in the US, has set a rate essentially for reimbursement so that it's trying to basically take out a barrier for people getting testing. So right now, what we should all be focused on is how do we enable testing and getting the right thing done and encouraging innovation there. I think it actually sets a huge opportunity for particularly, new sciences, new ways of thinking to get out there. Our goal is not to profit substantially. It's really to deliver it, and to deliver it at scale, to demonetize it ultimately, because that's what it's going to have to happen. And I think the insurance, the CMS has done a good job of encouraging and allowing us to basically recoup from a very responsible standpoint, and be able to make this sustainable.
Excellent. May, thank you so much. Before we segue to our very esteemed next guests, Elizabeth Cousins, one, thank you so far, Dr. Nabarro and May, and would like to give a little bit of a special shout out to someone who is on the live Zoom today, and that is Joelle Jarvis, who really did a masterful job putting all of this together. Does wonderful, wonderful work. And sometimes we get the question, Angelo, how did you get multiple hours on stage interviewing, which was a little intimidating Tony Robbins last summer? It was because of Joelle Jarvis, who not only has a wonderful heart and is incredibly connected, but has been incredibly valuable to me and many others. So Joelle Jarvis, thank you so much. On that note, let's move on because we do have a tight schedule. So yes, we're getting a fair amount of chat questions, but understand we have incredibly limited time with each participant. So it's going to be hard to weave questions that you may be asking, unlike some more of the other programs that we do, where with one person, we have an hour and a half, an hour and 45 minutes. Elizabeth Cousins, as I noted, CEO of the UN Foundation. Elizabeth, how are you?
Very well. Thank you, Angela. Great to be here with you.
All right. It's our pleasure. So first question for you. The UN Foundation jumped into action early in this pandemic, setting up the Solidarity Response Fund to support the work of the World Health Organization. So far, the fund has raised more than $200 million in 2.5 months? So it's pretty amazing. What has prompted you to set up the fund, and how do you explain the fund's early success?
Well, thanks, Angelo. First, maybe just a word about the UN Foundation, which may not be familiar to all of your listeners.
Please.
We were created 20 years ago by entrepreneur and philanthropist Ted Turner to support the UN and to help catalyze innovative solutions to major global challenges like pandemics. And one of our most consistent roles has always been to try to bring new partners into the UN ecosystem. So it was natural when the World Health Organization, with whom we'd worked a lot over the years, came to us in late February asking us, could we find a way to set up a vehicle or a platform that would allow people around the world who were not the traditional donors to the World Health Organization, which are of course governments, to find a way to contribute to COVID-19 response. So we went into overdrive. And in 3 weeks, we set up the COVID-19 Solidarity Response Fund on March 13th. We thought at the time we were going to be lucky if we got $50 million in this fund. In a month, we'd raised 100 million, and in 2 months, we'd topped 200 million, and we're now at about 216. And it comes from an extraordinary diversity of sources. Over 140 companies, many Fortune 500 companies, 375,000 people from dozens of countries who are donating by online platforms and in other ways, from artists, from gamers. We have employee giving campaigns. The gifts range from $10 million to $3. It is an extraordinary and just humbling display of generosity and solidarity that we've seen from the beginning, and the diversity of it is almost as compelling as the scale. We've been able to move quickly, and as those of you who are familiar with emergency environments know, fast money is absolutely everything in an emergency. You need it fast, you need it to go get where it needs to go with speed and agility, and we've been able to get funds in the door and out to where they're needed most. We like to say about the fund that it's all about the greatest need at the greatest speed, and that's what we've really been driven by. So we started dispersing funds within just a few weeks of having the fund online. And we've had an extremely high, what you call conversion rate of going from pledges to money in the bank to money out the door. So probably 2/3 of the funds that we've raised so far are already out the door, getting to where they're needed the most. When you ask what's made it work, I think there are a few different factors, and we're going to do a lot of lesson learning when this is all over, so we can really unpack all of this, both for our partners and for those in the community who want to understand what works and what doesn't. But first, people, corporations, foundations, I think everyone clearly grasps the extraordinary magnitude of this crisis that we're facing. and they wanted to find a way to help. And our fund gave them an early way to do that. So anyone, anywhere can contribute to it. And like I say, when you see the spread of donations from $10 million to $3 million from so many countries around the world, I think it's a sign that people wanted a way to help, and this gave them that. Second, we were very committed to fast disbursement and to transparent disbursement. So with all of our partners, with the community, we've been really clear from the beginning, here's where the money's going, here's what it's achieving. And I think that's made a difference. We've heard from a lot of our partners that the speed and the clarity was really important to them. Early on, we actually had some good seed funding from two of our partners, from Facebook and Google, who both set up online platforms and matches for people to give. And so that also gave us a really good early boost. But, I think the bottom line is that people actually get the basic value proposition. They get that global action and cooperation is essential when it comes to a truly global threat like this. And I think that's ultimately the most effective calling card.
And how has the money been used so far?
Yeah, well, it very much true to the spirit of, to the greatest need is where it's going. The vast majority has gone to the World Health Organization to procure and distribute essential medical supplies. So that's testing kits and reagents. It's the personal protective equipment we all hear so much about. That's gone out the door early to over 130 countries around the world. Some of the first bulk purchases of commodities like that were done through our fund. And just as an aside, as the crisis has continued, and sad to say that, of course, this is a marathon, not a sprint, but where countries are able in time to reimburse the World Health Organization for some of that equipment, our funds get freed up again to be used again. So they're really trying to use it efficiently and multiply. So that's one. Second, early funds out the door to UNICEF, for example, to do work in some of the most vulnerable communities, especially around sanitation and access to water, et cetera. Early funds out the door to the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, CEPI, which I'm sure many of you know, this multi-stakeholder platform designed to really surge money into R&D for things like vaccines, funds to the World Food Program that are running this very complex logistics supply chain to get the equipment and commodities out to where they're needed most, et cetera. So those are the kinds of things that our fund has been used for.
And we're a few months into the pandemic. What's changed about the fund's response?
Yeah, well, we're trying, to be agile and to be very responsive to the needs as they emerge. And I will say, real tribute to the World Health Organization. We've all streamlined everything on both our sides. Our contracting procedures have been streamlined. Their decision-making has been streamlined. So they've been quite quick about getting funds where they're needed the most. The biggest thing that's changed was bringing on early, though, new partners like UNICEF, like CEPI, like the World Food Program. The African CDC is another partner, UNHCR, to do work with refugees and displaced populations who are so profoundly at risk. I think the other thing is just recognizing the rhythm and tempo of this crisis. We are in a crisis that has both the acute, tempo of an emergency in the most extreme sense, but we know we're going to be at it for a while, and we're going to have these ebbs and flows of spikes, et cetera. And we need to all figure out how to handle that rhythm. So we're just going through a discussion right now with WHO, with our partners, about how to think about the fund and the resourcing of something that needs both urgent, quick action, but also sustained action.
Elizabeth, for the UN Foundation and given the pandemic, what's your ultimate goal?
Eradicating this virus, making sure that everybody gets what they need so that they can get past it and recover with equity and confidence. But I think, look, as I said, we are in both a marathon and a sprint. We have to handle both urgent needs and long-term needs. So from a resourcing perspective, we think a lot about that challenge. I think the needs are immense. If you look at the different numbers that come out with the various appeals, WHO is only halfway toward meeting its 1.7 billion need by the end of this year. There's humanitarian need that goes beyond COVID, by the way, and obviously goes to other acute vulnerabilities people face. But I also think you look at the scale of what the economy has already taken as a hit from this crisis, the trillions of dollars that governments are pumping into the economy to try to seed recovery and sustain recovery. So the billions start to look very small when you think about it that way. So our goal for the fund, really simply, is to just stay in this as long as we can, marshal as much support as we can, and quickly until our work is done.
I mean, you try to find silver linings in global challenges we're having like this. And in today's world being so digital, I suppose we could look a little positively to, for the most part, how the world is globally collaborating, from countries to scientists to broadly humanitarians and people, like never before. And again, part of that simply has to do to be more of a digital world compared to, let alone 50 years ago, even 10 years ago. What are you taking from the UN's perspective, the UN Foundation, as to some things we're learning in this process that could be beneficial from a humanitarian perspective moving forward?
No, thank you. Look, when I want to feel hopeful on any given day, and there are lots of grounds for hope, even in the darkest times. I think we all know that, and everyone on this call is dedicated to that. I sometimes go to those first platforms for online giving, and I look at all the comments that people have made when they have given $3, $7, $10 to this. There is such an extraordinary basis of instinctive generosity and solidarity around the world, in every country, in every community. It's not comprehensive, I get that, but there is so much of it. And that to me is an incredible reserve of, the most essential resource there is on the planet. And if we can find a way to tap that, to reinforce it, to strengthen it, I think we will certainly get through this crisis, but we will emerge much stronger for any other challenges we face.
Many of our listeners probably know, of course, that President Trump has threatened to withdraw it's probably about $500 million. It's a lot of money that the U.S. pays to the World Health Organization pending certain on-name reforms. What's your reaction?
Well, I'm glad you asked. This is obviously a topic of great concern and interest to us and many, and it's a complex and an important topic. I think there's a lot more heat than light. So my first hope is that people really look at this question in a dispassionate way, look at the facts and really think through, the overall issues and trade-offs. But three main points here. First, the World Health Organization, like the UN, needs the United States. The United States was the underwriter. It was the creator of most of these institutions. And the World Health Organization, like all of them, is stronger when the United States is in it and when the United States is playing a leadership role. We have such a long and proud track record of leadership in global public health, and it is just essential that we maintain it. That's the first point. Second, there's not an institution on the planet that is perfect. And there is no question but that there is scope to strengthen the World Health Organization and to make changes that will enhance its effectiveness, just like there is for other institutions. Dr. Nabarro mentioned earlier the fact that after every single emergency, there's a serious piece of forensic work that is done to look at what went right, what went wrong, and how to strengthen things going forward. That will be essential. I do think the good news is that the current leader of the WHO, Dr. Tedros, is actually a natural reformer. He has initiated so much change and transformation already in that organization in his first 3 years in office before this crisis broke. So I think there's a ready appetite to be serious there about ways to strengthen WHO going forward. And last, just an overall kind of thought about health issues and global leadership and global coordination. Set aside COVID for the moment. Until recently, we were on the verge of eradicating polio. We were getting ourselves on a path to eradicating measles that particularly kill kids under 5. That's about to be reversed. That all takes global cooperation. Look, we wouldn't have smallpox eradicated if we didn't have the World Health Organization. And really importantly, that was done at one of the most tense times globally, when the United States and the Soviet Union were not best friends, but they worked together to defeat that disease because they knew it mattered to their own populations and they knew it mattered to the world. So I look at all of that. I take great pride in the legacy of U.S. leadership in global public health, and I really hope and trust that it will continue.
More of a comment a little bit relative to who we are as an organization, family offices, given that's my focus. Things like you described and Dr. Nabarro, of course, an opportunity for best practices, a chance to look back. One of the things that we do is to help the family and the family office perhaps go through what we call a stress test and play out what-if scenarios. Because really, at the end of the day, the family office is primarily dedicated to solving problems before they happen, but that's difficult because there's black swan risk that are out there, but undergoing stress testing, looking back to look forward, seeing where things could be enhanced and improved, and playing out what if scenarios are important for organizations like yours and any company, and really any significant family and family office, and reminding the audience that pretty much every successful family I know, and it may be to their specific causes, but are active in charity and philanthropic endeavors, both locally and often globally. And maybe a little bit on that note, for those that would like to learn more and be supportive of the UN Foundation, how could they learn more about how to do that?
They can contact me. They can go to our website. If they're interested in the fund, they can go to covid19responsefund.org. We would be thrilled to talk to any of your audience and your members. And I'm very struck you're describing that about scenarios and volatility and having that sort of mindset, because that's clearly the kind of mindset we all need to bring to our work. It's what organizations need to do. It's what individuals and communities need to do. So very much appreciate the spirit of the question and would be thrilled to be in touch with any of your colleagues.
Thank you so much. We're now going to segue to the fourth of our fifth wonderful special guest today, and changing a little bit of the direction. First, I'll check in to make sure he's still with us. Jeff Gitterman, are you there?
Yes, I am.
All right, there you are. So to give a little bit of context, and we're really excited to have Jeff on. I've enjoyed him on Bloomberg, and he's really a wonderful thought leader in the impact investing arena. Giving a little bit of context to that, my experiences working with families for so long. 20 years ago, when impact investing started to become a verbiage, I'm going to say that maybe 3 to 5% of families of success were involved in impact investing. And the belief was, I believe in the cause and the value of me investing and putting my dollars there, and I actually expect to get lesser of a return, and I'm okay with that. And that dynamic started to change 10 years ago. It was probably, for my research, 12 to 15% of families were involved in some way in impact investing. And they started to get maybe a little bit more hungry for at least market-like returns, but were willing to accept potentially a little bit less for the value, again, of their beliefs and being a positive impact. But taking it now, some of the research that I did in the past year, and actually the thousands of single family offices, look at how these numbers have changed. I got the number now at about 1/3 to 40% of families are active in impact investing in some ways. They expect that these beliefs are going to get them a higher than average or traditional return. And I think as we're learning a little bit through COVID-19, admittingly, it's a short-term benchmark, but it has absolutely been true. But more important than even the returns is look at that percentage of families, 3 to 5%, 12 to 15%, now closer to 1/3 to 40%. Why has impact investing taken off so much?
Most of the data that we look at says that it's been driven by millennials going back to their parents and grandparents and saying that they have an issue around where the family money and family wealth is being spent. That's, at least on surveys, that's been a big driver of it. It's hard to, there's an old saying, it's easy to tell your kids no, it's impossible to tell your grandkids no. So
Very good.
You know, and we're in a different world. We're in a world where people are seeing that wealth is not necessarily protective in an environment where things are changing versus a static environment and economic scenario that we existed in for the last, few hundred years. Climate risk is being accepted as, finally being accepted in the United States as a reality rather than a hoax. The pandemic, I think, is still up in the air in the US as whether it's a hoax or reality, depending on what town you go to. But climate risk is finally being adopted as a science that is predictive, and that's changing how people think about the future of their wealth. It's putting a pressure on people to realize that without a stable environment, their old assumptions on economic models cannot be relied on as well as they used to be in the past. And when we talk about climate change and we look at climate risk and portfolio analysis, we look at pandemic risk right alongside that, because pandemic risk grows as the climate becomes more unstable. And as we push into nature as humans and as we grow our populations and interact more with nature, we drive the risk of pandemic up even further. Bats, I think, I'm not the expert here at all, so someone check me on this, but last I was told, I think bats can carry up to 1,400 different coronaviruses. So this won't be the first coronavirus. It obviously wasn't the first. It certainly won't be the last. And as we look at these issues and problems, we have to take a different tact of what we do with our wealth and what we invest
And we spoke offline relative, and you mentioned climate change, and that we recently had Jeremy Grantham on, who certainly is a wonderful entrepreneur, a philanthropist, and incredibly passionate and articulate on climate change. But let's take even a little bit of a more basic question, even though there's more of a foundational understanding in the verbiage impact investing and the numbers that I described to you. What is impact investing?
So I think, to make it simple, we think impact investing is all investing, because if you want to get a reality check on what you're doing with your money, you have to accept the fact that wherever you put your money, you're making an impact. You're voting every time you invest in a company, and you're voting every time you buy a product. And ultimately, you have to accept that scenario in order to be thoughtful and concerned about where you spend your money and invest your money going forward. You have to acknowledge the fact that if you're putting all your money with a tobacco company, then you're voting that your values support, tobacco. And I'm not making a judgment with that statement. I'm just making a fact with that statement. Now, real true impact investing, where you're measuring the impact of your dollars. So what you really want to do once you start doing impact investing is you want to know that a dollar invested has a measurement on the outcome that I expect with that dollar invested. So that's the very narrow definition of impact investing. It's intentional and measurable. And in order, though, for investing in general to become a driver for how we exist as humanity going forward, we have to realize that every single dollar we invest or spend is a vote about where our values are. We have to align those two in order to get to a world that is more sustainable.
And I agree with your comment you said earlier that millennials are the driving force behind their maybe being generational, second or third generation, or as entrepreneurs, but in really believing in their social values, in inequality and climate change, and really driving, so to speak, impact investing. What is it about millennials? And I mean, I'm learning this applies whether they position themselves more as liberal or conservative. They really seem to be behind, again, they want to align their investments with their social beliefs. What is it about that generation, and probably the Generation Z upcoming, that feels similarly?
Look, in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what you would see is that in order to have an interest in really self-actualization or deeper meaning or purpose, your basic needs have to be taken care of. So when you look at the original founders of most of the family offices that you're dealing with, a lot of them are first-line businesses that were created in times where the world wasn't that, stable for them. And they grew maybe even out of poverty to create these incredible businesses and family offices. The children and grandchildren of that have grown up with an entirely different situation. It allows them the freedom or the privilege to be able to think about self-actualization, meaning, and purpose. You can't think about those things. You can't be concerned with impact of the planet and your relationship with the planet if you're worried about where your next meal is going to come from. So we really rely on these families that have the luxury of being able to think more deeply about the interconnection between the planet and ourselves, and that the longevity of both are intertwined with each other. We rely on these families to be the drivers of startups and impact companies that will be able to create new advantages against the adversities that we face. But that's really the reason that we're seeing that. But then also there is a shift in consciousness. You look at Greta, as being Person of the Year, and the ability for her to drive children to strike and deal with issues. They do feel like their future is in jeopardy. And this is probably the first generation that maybe since the scenario in the 50s when we had to hide under our desks in the case of the possibility of a nuclear war. But this is the first time that you have a generation of kids that are growing up with active shooter drills. They're growing up with climate change being a topic of conversation in their TV shows and in movies and in the news on a consistent basis. And it is a real overhanging threat to these children that the future is not guaranteed. And a lot of prior generations didn't grow up with that sense of doom that unfortunately these kids are growing up with.
No question. I'm seeing and hearing the same thing. We'll get back to one or two more questions to Jeff, just a little bit of a sidebar. We have very active discussions, which is great, in our chat feature here on Zoom. And Dr. Nabarro was so gracious and kind because there were questions that I just didn't have time to ask. And it's not like he's avoiding them at all. He actually gave out his personal contact info for those that want to reach out to him. So perhaps he could have more time to give a thoughtful response. So again, it's not like I don't want to involve more of our live participants who are asking questions, but we're just going to be a little bit limited on time. But kudos to Dr. Nabarro for doing that. Jeff, where are some areas that you see potential for tremendous growth financially and for positive impact in our new normal?
So just to set the stage quickly about how to think about this, when you think about climate change, you think about more floods, more droughts, more extreme weather, and more extreme heat, and then also pandemic risk. So you've got these 5 areas that you're thinking about. And in any crisis, there is both danger and opportunity. So when you think about de-risking your portfolios, right now there's no premium paid to own municipal bonds in Colorado, Vermont, and Buffalo versus downtown Houston, which is flooding regularly now, Northern California, which is subject to severe droughts, or even downtown Miami or the Keys, where consistent storms and flooding is putting in jeopardy the long-term infrastructure in those areas. So climate risk is an unpriced risk right now. And what's weird is they call it a green swan. While it's an unpriced risk, it's not a black swan. We know climate change is coming. The models over the last 30 or 40 years have actually, the standard deviation on the models have narrowed tremendously. So we're getting more and more confidence in the data around climate risk. There are companies like 427, Carbon Delta, Climate Risk out of Brooklyn that are measuring that data. And the rating agencies, Moody's, Fitch, S&P, AM Best, have now bought those data companies and have said publicly they are going to start pricing in physical climate risk in the municipal bonds, the mortgages, the hard real estate that they look at. So those are all areas where you can de-risk your portfolios and not pay any premium for it at all. So there's no cost right now to de-risking the really ravages that we're seeing of climate risk on the ground. But then there's huge opportunities. We work with Wellington Asset Management and Woods Hole, which is the top climate risk nonprofit agency in the world, most likely. And when you look at opportunity, you look at extreme heat spreading across Europe and add a pandemic to that going into the summer, people are staying home much more. Opportunities around figuring out how to cool homes and provide more stable at-home environments for the elderly to not be at risk as they have been in the last severe heat waves that they've had across Europe, where they've lost thousands of elderly lives due to that. So there's opportunities for that. There's opportunities for storm walls. In Boston, they've put up these pop-up storm walls around buildings that are literally air compressed that can protect the base of the building. So it's really not as difficult. Finding the right startup that's going to solve the problem, that's always a little bit more difficult, but the areas where you need to be thinking about are not difficult. And the areas where you can be de-risking right now at no additional cost to you are not difficult to find either. And we've created what is the first UMA, Unified Managed Account, that brings together the top managers in the world, really, that are focused on climate change, sustainable infrastructure, water asset management, Wellington and their Woods Hole climate leadership strategy to make it easy to start investing in the defense of the risk of climate change and the opportunities, that come with climate change as well.
What do you see, and likely last question, what do you see as the role and perhaps obligation for family offices, which probably is code speak for top 0.001%, highly, highly successful families to be active in impact investing because it truly makes a difference?
So, the difficulty is this death valley. I'm sure you've heard this term, where if you're raising under $25 million as a startup with a great idea of how to solve, major world problems, the access to that money is so difficult. It's considered death valley. We've been talking regularly now with the UN and how to get families and the UN to de-risk the idea that these startups are where some of the best ideas are going to come from. So these public-private partnerships that could be done are really the secret to unlocking that. And family offices, I understand the difficulty. Investing 25, 50, 100, even $500,000 sometimes takes so much due diligence that it's not worth it at those levels. But if we can create partnerships between family offices and the UN, where the UN could potentially de-risk the initial investment sleeve, and with grants and foundation funding, and then get family offices to ladder on with their donor advised funds, maybe initially, where they're not really concerned as much with the return on the principal, and then secondarily with equity and debt investments. We need to find pool ways to fund lots of these ideas and make it easier for family offices to do that and de-risk that from a one-off investment with all the due diligence that takes on a small investment amount. So that is, I think, and donor advised funds make up, $150 billion in the United States. And most of those funds are sitting in core stock and bond 50-50 portfolios and mutual funds and equities. And the return is, analogous. It's not important to the donor. That is the first tranche of money that we should be working with family offices on. How do we decouple that from traditional investing and move that into the impact space?
And Jeff, given the work that you do advising families on perhaps exactly what we just said about how to be more impactful with their investments, as well as those that would like to watch you more on Bloomberg, how could they learn more about you?
So our show is available at fintech.tv. Compilations of the show also air on Bloomberg on Saturdays at 7:30. But all the shows stream live at fintech, fintech.tv. And our firm, gittermanwealth.com, is available as a resource, tons of content on there about impact and sustainable investing as well. And then we work with the UN and host the Sustainable Investment Conference annually in partnership with UNCDP and Office of Partnership. That's October 26th this year in New York City. And that information is also under events at our website. Last year, we did the Family Office Conference with the UN in September at the United Nations in New York. Mm-hmm. We had over 250 family offices in attendance, and it was called by Bloomberg the best conference they've ever attended. So,
except for perhaps mine, of course.
Yes, I defer. I defer, definitely, yes.
But actually, on that note, they did an amazing job, and I encourage you now. This year's schedule, because of physical events, is going to be limited, but they're probably doing something digitally, and simply to reach out to Jeff, and it can help connect you to be more involved. And they do a great job, and that was a wonderful, wonderful program, I might add. Thank you so much, Jeff. That's incredibly helpful. And Dr. Nabarro, I think you have to say goodbye, but thank you for staying with us. We appreciate your time today as well. And that leaves us last but never least, Ed Martin. Ed, how are you?
I am well, Angelo. I appreciate the invitation.
So the last time I saw Ed, as I noted, was one of the more significant events that we hosted, as I noted, thanks to Joelle Jarvis, last August on the waterfront in Santa Monica at Costa del Mar, where I saw Ed. We've kept in touch before that over the years, and it was a wonderful opportunity to hear people like Peter Diamandis, who we're hoping to have on in the next week or two. So we're very, very excited about that. And obviously my interview with Tony Robbins, but we had Naveen Jain, Kathy Ireland, so many others. It was a lot of fun. It was great to see you. And you're doing some amazing things, which pretty much will piggyback, but go in a little different direction for some of the speakers that we currently had on during this podcast. Why don't we start with, Ed, because you're so unique in what you do and what you're active in, give us a little bit of an overview in terms of what you have your hands in. You got some good news, you got Fifth Element. Talk to us. What are you up to?
Yeah, well, thanks, Angelo, and I appreciate being on with such a great great group. I know a few of you in advance, and I love Joelle too. So I appreciate your shout out to her. Well, the company that I'm a partner of is called Fifth Element Group, and it's a public benefit company with the entire focus being how do you create these unique omni-win opportunities and partnerships in order that each individual organization involved moves forward with their specific KPIs in their business. But at the same time, the byproduct of that is it supports solving United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So we were actually created and we were launched at the United Nations, and we were launched on International Women's Day. And so a portion of, if you look at our title, Fifth Element Group, in terms of the name of our company, a big part of the reason for Fifth was that SDG 5 is, I think most folks know, is all about gender equity. And as you include the half the population that's currently not at that equal level, we believe that that has a huge impact on overall sustainable development goals. So the focus of our group is around creating what we call these omni-wins. And one of the ones that we mentioned to you briefly before was the John Krasinski show. About 8 or 9 weeks ago, he came out with a show, and it was around this idea that there's so much tremendous, weighty, oftentimes negative news, and how can you at least bring hope and light and bring and involve different communities into the mix where you get a bit of a reprieve from that and have the opportunity to share some hopeful things. And one of the things I think that John really understood was that brands, authentic brands who had that leadership and said, I want to be a part of this in some way, but also I wanted to be connected to what my core business is. They invited in some additional brands to do that. And our role very much is around the corporate side as well. We work with a lot of global leaders in the corporate side, entertainment industry and things of that nature. So we ended up helping put together, as an example, this last one around Starbucks, where they were looking at unlocking capital that Starbucks was going to spend against a particular cause. And then what ends up happening, you have a lift from this incredible audience of influencers to raise the brand warmth of Starbucks, doing the thing that Starbucks would want to do anyway. So it's really drawing from additional pools of capital to help fund SDGs.
And talk a little bit about what you're doing with Some Good News.
Yeah, so the way that it works with that particular program is, if you look at OmniWins, they're based on a number of different ingredients, if you will. So you have an audience that is a very large audience, and of course, Some Good News had everybody from Oprah to Steven Spielberg to all these incredible, talented folks who also have their own communities. And then you pull together nonprofits, and a lot of nonprofits had to deal with most of what we focused on is on the COVID-19 response issues. So it was anything from helping to fund frontline restaurant workers to even things like the Boys and Girls Club. And so what we end up doing is putting together an initiative where a brand could step into an opportunity to be able to get, let's say, for instance, 10, 15, $20 million of advertising value in a way that would be significantly lower cost for them. But the monies that they would have normally spent on advertising and media spend ended up being utilized then to support COVID-19 related issues. And so that's what we actually call a good exchange. And a big focus for us as I listen to the other panelists is about how do we free up the over $1 trillion in the global marketing budgets that float around to try to connect to consumers in a way where someone's day job can be more productive. So that money being spent against engaging consumers can be spent in a way that's more productive for the company, but at the same time, it drives incremental funding for World Health Organization and organizations like that that are doing impactful world work.
And so, turning that from being an influencer generated account into a profit and fundraising center, that's pretty intriguing. Maybe I'll take a little bit of a step back because I don't know how many of our audience is really going to even know that terminology, influencer generated, and how that tends to be more younger, dynamic, social media centric. If you could explain a little bit about that and the transition, again, into a profit and fundraising center.
Yeah, you bet. You know, I fell into this, Angelo, in the early '90s. My
Wow.
background is I worked in some of the largest companies in the world. I worked for Kellogg's and Coca-Cola and Citigroup and Ford Motor Company and the Hershey Company. And any of these companies, we had, of course, our foundation, which was amazing. And then we had our normal operating sort of businesses. And so in the early '90s, I started being asked by people at the Kellogg Company, you know, for money. They said, "Ed, you work for a big multi-billion-dollar company. How about some money?" And I said, "Well, I work as a global marketing person, so I don't really have the giving money." I said, "But I tell you what, if you've got, if you're telling me that you're working with 10,000 moms, and you can mobilize 10,000 moms to eat cereal once a week, and tell me if they like the cereal, then I can just pull the money that I was going to use in my market research budget and my advertising budget and give it to you. And then that way you get a lot more money than you're going to get from the foundation anyway. And from my standpoint, I'm able to deliver against the business, which was my core responsibility and my job." And so I realized that I was actually able to fund a fairly significant number of causes that way, because I would simply just match what the business need was to what the community I was trying to connect with. And as the years went by, obviously mobile became very large, and now we've got to a point where we literally, almost anywhere in the world that a brand or a business needs to connect with a community, we've been doing this for so many years that we have the opportunity to connect with virtually any community where the community actually turns toward the brand and then monetizes their engagement. So watching an ad or friending a Facebook ad or downloading an app, anything that a brand would actually spend money on to drive their KPIs and their return on investment. We're looking at how do you do that in a way that's more productive for the brand or the business, but at the same time, the reason that the people are doing it in those communities is because it unlocks funding to support something that they deeply care about. And that's why, as I'm looking at even today's call, we've got a number of business units set up where our whole focus is to try to unlock at least 5% of the $1 trillion+ in the global marketing spend in order to help fund sustainable development goals. I mean, that's the aspiration for us. And I think when your family offices look at, many of them, of course, created significant wealth from various businesses. And if they look at 5% of how they would be more productive with their assets, and whether it be in their own businesses or their investing through these really unique partnerships, it could be a really significant uptick for them from a benefit standpoint, but in a way that also lifts communities at the same time.
And one of the chat feature questions that came in is a good follow-up. Is there a way that families can do the same? In other words, can they help support or invest in OmniWins?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the way that these work, it's really interesting. Oftentimes, we put together groups that are typically not working with each other. So we have one particular group called Trauma Free World, and trauma-informed care is such an important aspect of a lot of at a root cause issue why there's so much challenge, whether it be conflict or, you know, opioid use or what have you. And it was started with a family office support, heavily with a family office support that seeded it. And then the brands came in after. Google actually is a really amazing partner, and I know also a partner to the UN Foundation, but the president of Google Brands is a real big supporter of that. And so you have family office, then you had the nonprofit, then you had top academics and universities, and you had brands, you had state level people, federal people. So it's putting together and aligning everybody's incentive in terms of what they're trying to achieve. But I think, to be honest, it was only really helped be from a kickoff standpoint, from a family office stand. And then I think that was part what Jeff was talking about as well. Mm-hmm. There's oftentimes a gap between being able to be a catalyst to kick off the rest of what I would say the the organizational partnerships, because it's that initial seed funding that typically is the hardest to get.
And how can we pivot our business, our family office model in a way that impacts, let's say, the UN goals and make money?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Because we've been doing this work for so many years too, we tend to get the absolute best on tech innovation. And so people come to us often, and we get hundreds and hundreds, similar probably to the folks that you have, but we're also very, very deep in the marketplace. So we're very deep in terms of what local activations are happening. And so I'll give you one example. I had one of our dear friends was married to Mary Tyler Moore, and Mary Tyler Moore was going, losing her sight towards the end of her life. And he's very, very dedicated on preventing blindness from diabetes. And so in this particular case, we ended up pulling an organization, the only FDA approved AI autonomous screening for blindness, that we were able to kind of take a look at and say, well, actually, how do we take something forward that we know is a leading technology and allow people who normally don't have access to really any eye screening for blindness, but put it in an environment where they now have access to it, and actually the best in the world because of leveraging that tech. So I would say a lot of the innovations that we see, we are often, we can't work with them all, but the ones that we see that fundamentally we believe will have impact on SDGs, we often try to share with other family office folks, because I think in some ways they're going to look at that as both a very, very significant opportunity financially, but it's also already set up with communities that we can plug it into and actually get use from it.
And Ed, for those that would like to learn more about the amazing work that you're doing and everything that we described, of course, including Fifth Element, how could they learn more?
Yeah, thanks, Angelo. The site is fithelement.group with a 5, fithelement.group. And yeah, I would love to talk to anybody who's looking at saying, look, we've got assets, resources, and our day job, and we're trying to do that more productively. And if you guys can help us think through how to be more productive in what the KPIs that we have, in a way that helps unlock additional funding to support World Health Organizations, World Food Program, UN Foundation, et cetera, then that would be a great 1-hour conversation, because we typically can look across all those different sectors and fairly quickly get a feel for if there's something that we can be helpful with.
And actually, we're not quite finished with you yet. Maybe one last question as well. How can families be a part of an OmniWin without having a foundation? How can they find or start an OmniWin relationship for something they care about? They may have the money and a passion, but don't know how to match them up effectively.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's interesting, Angela. Typically, of all the companies that I've worked for and most of the organizations, I oftentimes get people to pull me alongside and say, after the meetings were done, and they say to me, hey, Ed, I care about Alzheimer's, or I care about autism, or I care about cancer. I care about, this is my thing. How do I create an OmniWin like that? And in some ways, we've got what we call our SDG circle as an example. And it's these large influencer, purpose-driven clusters all over the world. We meet at Nobel, we meet at Skoll, we meet at World Economic Forum, and all these folks are focused on OmniWin. So we've got these hubs, and pretty much, I would say, we've got a fairly decent coverage across just about every area that you could potentially be interested in. So again, I'm more than happy if someone just has a very deep personal interest. That's typically how many of the journeys begin in terms of how I get to know people, because they call me up and they say, I appreciate what you did over here on girls' education, but I care really deeply about Alzheimer's because of my father. And so then we start the journey and say, okay, well, that's great. There's a bunch of folks who also care about that. And it looks like you have these 3 ingredients, and I can identify the other 2 that you need in order to kind of put something together that's going to be beneficial for all of you.
Excellent. Well, it was really a lot of fun today to do, for me, a complex with 5 different guests. But I hope our live audience enjoyed it, as well as those that will watch this on YouTube or hear it on my Spotify, Apple, or one of my other podcasting platforms. And all of our participants, including just wrapping up with Ed Martin, were fantastic. I wish we had more time individually with each, and over the course of through this year, I'm sure that will happen as well, where we could do a deeper dive specifically, but I felt it was intriguing to do this in a little different format, and hopefully you all had a chance to enjoy it. In terms of my close, other than that, and many of you know I do this pretty much at every video and podcast, I'm Angelo Robles. I'm the host of Angelo Robles's Effective Family Office podcast. Again, Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, and other platforms. We hope you enjoy it. My YouTube station, where a lot of the videos go, is very simply Family Office. I registered that a long, long time ago, so it's a great name. Look me up on YouTube simply and subscribe. It's Family Office. And I'm the founder and CEO at Family Office Association, a global membership organization dedicated to families of great success and their single family offices, providing a significant amount of proprietary content, hosting global programming, on hold now because of COVID-19, but becoming more technically proficient in digital and modernizing in today's world. Monday through Friday, we host a daily membership meetings. We have great guests like we're having on today, and some of them, like this one, get converted to a video or podcast so we can have a little bit more dissemination broadly to a wider audience, which is beneficial to all. We do some things strictly for members only, including no guests, no experts, just peer-to-peer once a week or once every other week. We do those and have a whole bunch of other platforms we added for our members to communicate privately 24/7, for us to disseminate some unique and proprietary content on our private portal, and a bunch of consultative and other services that, to give you context, this is late May. I should have mentioned that earlier for those that are going to hear this a month or 2 or 3 months or 6 months from now, because so much of it is so fluid given COVID-19. Some of it will, of course, need to be updated. So in context of the times, again, we're right after Memorial Day here in the US. It is late May of course, 2020. But feel free to learn more about us. We have lots going on. It's been a very invigorating time for us at Family Office Association. I am active, as noted, Family Office on actually both Twitter and YouTube, Family Office Association on Instagram, Angelo Robles and Family Office Association on LinkedIn, probably my biggest platform. My website's familyofficeassociation.com, angelorobles.com, and likely preferred email, angelo@familyofficeassociation.com. Thank you all for our live participants today, our listeners in. Thank you all for the 5 wonderful guests we had. I appreciate your time. You all did a fantastic job. And those of you that watch this on video or listen to it on an audio podcast, we hope you enjoy it. Look forward to the next time. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.